Well, it's a great pleasure for me to have Alan Brough with us today to talk about his book on Jack Malloch. And it just so happens that today we received the news from the International Book Awards that Alan is a finalist in the biography section for the year's best biography. So congratulations, Alan. Really pleased it's worked out as well as it has.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I guess we're always surprised to get those sort of accolades, but the thing that I think is so great about that is that it really means that people will be interested in reading the story without having necessarily an African or Rhodesian or Southern African connection. And that'll at least make them interested in reading the biography. And I think that helps us tell our stories to the rest of the world. And that's really always been part of my intention, is how can we preserve our history and tell it to the world, not just to ourselves, because sort of we know the story. It's more about how do we tell the rest of the world what happened in our part of the world and who our heroes are.
Alan, just hold the book up.
So this is the book how it appears, and as you'll see, it's a reasonably thick publication with sort of a couple of pictures in between. But
just up a bit more.
That's the Jack Malloch book, and you can see the picture of Jack in the cockpit of the Spitfire there with the symbolic storm clouds in the background. Yeah.
All right, great. Alan, let's just let's get going on talking about Jack. Just, in my opinion, I don't know if anybody in the private sector contributed as much as Jack Malloch did during that difficult time to keep the country going. His contribution was enormous, and he took massive risks, and he really put the country way before his own personal welfare. And while he wasn't a fighting man in the true sense during the Rhodesian War, I mean, he was a fighter pilot in the battle in World War II, but he was right in the thick of things, and I don't think there was anything he wouldn't have done for the country that he absolutely loved and gave his all. But let's just go back to Jack, just a little bit about his early history through up to the Second World War.
Jack was an interesting character, and he grew up. His family immigrated to Southern Rhodesia, as it was at the time. When Jack was quite young, I think he was 4 or 5, quite young. But from that very early age, he really had a passion and an interest in aviation. And of course, the family moved to Umtali, as it was then. And there was only one aircraft in the whole town, and it was some rich fellow who had bought an aircraft. And Jack, after school, would go and just polish the aircraft and look at it and chat to this old guy, and was fascinated by the aircraft. It was as if there was something in his blood. He was really passionate about this. And so right from that early age, you could see that this was an extraordinary passion for him. But interestingly enough, he didn't do well at school. He wasn't an academic. And these days, when you think about pilots and the rigorous training, and even then there was rigorous training, lots of exams to get through. Yet Jack pretty much fell out of school at the age of 15 and didn't really pass his exams or anything. And by 15, he was in an apprenticeship at a garage to basically service cars. And yet he always had this passion for aviation. And he was fixated on how could he become a pilot with his bad school marks, which everybody said to him wasn't enough to get him through. And when the war started, he actually saw that as his opportunity to try and get into aviation. And he refused to get involved in the war in any other way except becoming a pilot. to the point where actually draft dodgers were beginning to look twice at him and think maybe we need to see what's up with this guy. And he just said, I can join, but I have to be a pilot. And right, as I say, right from that early age, he had that passion to get into aviation. And I think that was really the theme of his life.
And then he then trained in Rhodesia?
Yeah, Rhodesia became really a training center for pilots. And I think that's probably why we had as a nation, such an interest and sort of involvement in aviation as a result of that. We had 6 training schools. They were called RATAG training schools, RATG, I think. And those were training schools at the different air bases that were actually built for that World War II training. And we were seen, I think Rhodesia and Canada and a couple of other places were really seen as the funnel for pilots to get to the front line. And that was where Jack got into that process pretty much at the end of it, because by the time they eventually let him onto the course, and it was only through literally the recruiters being worn down by him coming in every week saying, I've got to be on this. By that stage, they were actually looking more for navigators and bombers and engineers and that sort of thing. And they said to him, look, with your mechanical background, you'll be perfect for an engineer. That's what you've got to do. And he refused. But he did eventually get onto it and went through Thornhill and a couple of other of the training schools before finally getting his wings and being sent to Egypt, where he did his combat conversion training.
And Alan, what was his tie-up with the man who was to become Prime Minister, Ian Smith? Were they in the same squadron? I can't remember.
They were in the same squadron. It was 237 Rhodesia Squadron. And a lot of the pilots who went through the training in Rhodesia and who were from the country were earmarked for 237. So a lot of them went into 237 Squadron, which ended up being a Spitfire Squadron. Their motto was actually first in the air, and they were literally the first squadron to engage in combat at the beginning of the Second World War. They'd been deployed up into central North Africa, basically the Somaliland border, and they were literally the first in the air upon the declaration of the Second World War. Ian Smith had gone into 237 Squadron a little bit ahead of Jack Malloch. He'd been there about a year before. So he was already quite a senior pilot by the time Jack arrived at the squadron. Jack arrived there because it took him so long to get onto the training. He arrived at the squadron really at the beginning of 1944. And I think Ian Smith had been there at least a year before. So they didn't really know each other well in those first early couple of weeks, but quite quickly they started flying together. And in Jack's logbook, you can see quite a few of the sorties that they did. They flew together. So they obviously got to know each other quite well. Ian also arrived at the squadron a little bit after Jack did, because he had been in hospital after his accident where he did so much damage to his face. And I think that's also an interesting reflection on Jack, that Ian didn't look good. He'd had experimental plastic surgery and had a lot of injuries from that accident. And Jack embraced him as a friend. They got on really well, never thought twice about the scarring and how Ian looked, because it took him a long time to recover from that. But they ended up being good friends, and that friendship continued for the rest of Jack's life. Yeah.
Was he shot down, Alan?
Yeah, they both of them were, Ian and Jack. Jack was shot down in early 1945, and in fact, the Rhodesia Squadron suffered most of their casualties in those last few months of the war in 1945. Jack had been hit by flak on numerous occasions prior to that. They were in the thick of battle, chasing the Germans really up Italy and back into Germany as that front was collapsing. So if you read Jack's logbook, there's quite a lot of references of his tail having to be replaced from flak damage and all that sort of thing. But when he was shot down, he was strafing and got caught in a sort of hail of flak, which hit the engine, and he had a glycol leak, which is the cooling system of the Spitfire. So he knew he had about 3 minutes to fly before the plane would catch fire or something, or the engine would seize. And he was flying over mountainous terrain. So he got as far away as he could, tried to keep altitude, was losing altitude. And eventually, when the engine did seize, he realized he had to jump out. He was a little bit low though, so bailed out, and the bailing out was problematic because he got caught on, I think the ferry pistol caught his parachute, and it was a difficult exit. And as he fell, he also caught his watch his father had given him. And as he fell out the cockpit of the aircraft, his watch came off, and he saw it in the air and was trying to grab it because it had great sentimental value. And of course, forgot to pull the ripcord, and then would realize that he was too low, pulled the ripcord and hit the ground very hard because it had hardly opened by the time he hit. And when he sort of came to, there was an angel over him looking down at him, and everything was white, and it was quite ethereal. And he just presumed that he had died, and he was quite pleased that angels looked like what we interpret them to be. Then, of course, he realized when he felt the pain in his leg, he had actually landed in a graveyard in the city of Piacenza in Italy. And quickly, the sort of locals came, grabbed him, and took him away and hid him. And he had done a lot of damage to his one leg. He had shattered his ankle quite badly, and that began a whole story of being hidden by the partisans, moved around, and all the time his leg was getting worse. And that was a big whole part of the story in itself, but yeah, he had quite a lot of drama, and was eventually flown out from behind enemy lines in a captured German Storch. They eventually got him out that way. So he certainly had an interesting escape at that point. And he arrived back at the squadron literally about a week or two before the end of the Second World War.
Alan, after the war, he came back to Rhodesia, and he had a garage in Mercenary, I think, in a sort of transport company for a while.
Yeah, that's right. His parents, Jack came back from the war, and he was changed when he came back. While he was with the partisans, the family that had taken him in Piacenza, they had a couple of daughters, and Jack fell in love with one of the daughters. And the two of them and the second daughter, both the daughters, were sent off with the partisans into the mountains to hide. The parents actually got rid of them all because the Germans were hunting for this pilot. So Jack didn't want to come back. He wanted to stay with this girl and, really build his life there with her. And the parents sort of objected to that. They hadn't seen their son for a good couple of years because of the war, and they were desperate to see him. And it was a big mission to get back. We didn't have easy transport as we do now. But when he came back, he was definitely changed. He was wounded, and I think the war affected him. And so what he did is he went off and tried prospecting, went up to Bechuanaland, did a bit of prospecting. And during that time, Jack's father thought, look, we need to sort of consolidate and come together and hold Jack. I think that was really the plan. So he was the one who decided, let's go and run a family garage in Marandellas. And Jack had the garage background from his apprenticeship before when he left school. And his father was very good at running a business. He was very mechanical. He used to be a truck driver for the Rhodesian Railways, as it was at that stage. And Jack's mother had a financial background, so she could run the book. So they set up and ran this family business there. And after a while, his parents had a bad accident, and that sort of killed the business to a degree. But Jack stayed on, got his own garage there, and actually then inherited his father's trucking business and ran trucks as well. So ran quite a successful business for quite a long time. It was probably 8 or 10 years that he ran that in Marandellas, probably throughout from 1945 to about 1951, 52. That was his primary focus, the garage and his trucking business.
But it was got a little bit boring for him. Alan, he was looking for a bit more excitement.
How it worked out is that one of the guys who ran a competitive trucking business in Marandellas also had an aeroplane. He had bought a little aircraft, World War II surplus one, and used to take off from the backyard. He had a little grass strip at the backyard and would take off and go and fly around. It was just a little 2-seater aircraft. But of course, that fascinated Jack. It was rather like how when he was a school kid, he used to go and, pamper this aircraft, never flew in it, but just loved it. So became friends with this guy, a chap called Jamie Marshall. And it was through the aircraft that they became friends and competitors. And one night they were at dinner at the Mallochs. They'd invited the Marshalls over and they were chatting about that. And the wives were saying how terrible it was. You couldn't get fresh fish pretty much anywhere in Rhodesia at the time, especially Marinedellas. And of course, Jamie and Jack started saying, well, I wonder if you couldn't fly it in. And that was the genesis of Fish Air. And they eventually decided to go into partnership in the aircraft, bringing in fresh fish. Of course, the two-seater was too small. They bought another one. But it was really, again, Jack's passion for aviation and flying that really opened that opportunity. And he gave up the trucking business and went into full-time flying as a result of that. And that was his way in. But he had always been passionate about keeping up with flying.
Alan, I know he got involved in the Nigerian Civil War, the Biafran secessionist movement, but tell us how that actually happened, how he came to be involved.
That was really, and we were talking a little bit earlier about sort of fighting men of Rhodesia, and I think that Jack really qualifies when you think about why he got involved in these sort of conflicts and what drew him to them and what his sort of belief and commitment was. It was really driven by a need to help people. He had a very strongly Christian upbringing, and he had a very strong sense of morality and what was right and wrong. And at that time, from sort of the late 50s, the winds of change were blowing through Africa, and there was a rash of independence across all of the different colonies there. And where Jack's involvement in sort of military flying started was actually not with Biafra, but with Katanga. And Jack was, although his mother and grandfather were both very good accountants, Jack was terrible at accounting. He couldn't follow the money for the life of him, but he loved flying. And consequently, he would run these charter businesses and these aviation operations, but they never really did very well financially. And what happened is he was tempted by his neighbor to take very good and very lucrative charter contracts for this province in Congo called Katanga. And he was actually compelled to do it. He didn't want to because it was quite dangerous at the time, because the Congo really fell apart almost straight after independence. But Jack took these contracts on in the beginning because he had to, from a financial point of view. He really needed the money. So he took them on for the money, started flying there, and then very quickly got to see the political situation on the ground and realized how this province was really trying to work with sort of a multiracial approach and a more democratic approach, and trying to resist the communist encroachment that which was right on the tails of the winds of change. And that really gave Jack a great passion to commit himself, his business, to helping this little enclave that was trying to hold off and resist communism. And it was as a result of that, having gone through the whole Katanga thing, that when Biafra came up, he was very keen or very open to helping, because it was very similar cause. They were really a breakaway state trying to hold off from the Federalists and to resist communist encroachment. And that was really, I think, what got Jack involved. But it was ironic, because when Jack went to Biafra for the very first time, he was again on the verge of bankruptcy. And the only way they got there was one of his employees. On the day they were going to go, Jack looked at the numbers and he didn't have enough money available to buy the fuel to get there to take the contract. And they had to get there to take the contract. And so he basically went to the last of the employees that he had and said, look, we just can't do it. I'm done. And I'll split the money that I've got left with you to try and pay off as much of your salary as I can, but we're done. And one of the employees came to him and said, look, I've got some savings. Can I put it on the table? That's enough money for the fuel. Let's go. And that was how he got there. And that was a transformational opportunity, because for a year and a half, or 2 years, they were being funded by the French Secret Service and a lot of major backers. That was really where Jack got very involved with the French, and that served him for the rest of his life as well.
And Alan, in the Congo, he got obviously to work quite closely with Mike Hall, I think, of Wild Geese fame. And the guy that they were actually in support of was Moise Chombi, I think, who was a very moderate African nationalist who could see that the only way to responsible rule was to secede. So it's a pity that chaps like Mike Hall and Jack didn't prevail there in their efforts. And the Congo's been a mess ever since.
Well, I think that Chombi was was well before his time. Even before the Congo was granted its independence, he was talking about setting up the country as a federation of states. Because he was saying it's such a big country, you cannot rule one big country where the tribes are so completely different, speak completely different language. And so he was advocating for that right from the beginning. And he also advocated for multiracial development and cooperation with the West, which the rest of Africa at the time were embracing the Chinese and the Soviets. And almost on, I think, Jack's second or third trip into the Congo, he met with Mike Hall. And Jack's own neighbor, the guy who got him this contract in the first place, turned out to be very involved. He was essentially an early mercenary, and was selling himself as a military advisor to whoever he could. And that was really, so quite quickly Jack got into this whole sort of mercenary movement. But Mike Hall and Jack became good friends. They also remained friends for the rest of their life. And at the time, Bob Denard was also operating in Katanga. So that whole sort of club almost got to know each other in those early days. And as a reflection of Jack's character, he became close personal friends with President Chombi as well. And that's remarkable when you consider the whole sort of almost racial heritage that had been established in not just Africa, but throughout the colonies at the time. And yet Jack built this personal friendship, which was extremely strong. Jack and Chombi were close friends pretty much for the rest of Chombi's life. He didn't live particularly long. He was a victim of all of that, but they were close friends to the point where when Chombi left and when Katanga collapsed, he gave Jack a couple of his own aircraft as gifts to pay the debt that he owed, because he hadn't been able to pay a lot of Jack's bills. But he also just said, look, take these as a thank you for all of the support that you've given my country in the time. And that helped Jack actually build up a fleet, which he couldn't have afforded at the time.
And then along comes UDI. Ian Smith declares independence, and sanctions are imposed, international embargo, probably the tightest sanctions regimen in history was imposed on Rhodesia in a bid to throttle the country economically. And Jack came right to the fore very early on, didn't he?
He did. He was also quite a victim of sanctions in those early days. In 1965, I think it was, he was building up an airline called Rhodesian Air Services, and he had got routes for places like Mauritius. He was working on a route, or in fact had routes into London, into England, had routes into Europe, and was really building an international airline. And when UDI came along, a lot of those contracts were sort of cancelled overnight, and it became very much more difficult for him to operate. And he was sort of really struggling to try and keep the business going, taking any business he could, charter business, that sort of thing. And that's what really got him involved in Katanga and then Biafra after that. Biafra collapsed in the first weeks of 1970. And just before that collapse, Jack had also been worried about what was going to happen to his own country, because he could see the writing on the wall. He had seen this playbook in Katanga and Biafra and several other places, so he knew what was coming. And it started in the mid-19s or mid-69, thereabout, looking into supplying beef to the Gabonese. He became very close friends also with the president of Gabon, and Gabon was a springboard for his airlift into Biafra. So he had a base at a military airfield in Gabon. And through those conversations, he realized there was very little good quality beef there. And he knew that we were sitting on a bunch of great Rhodesian beef. And he started that beef flight into Gabon. And so by the time Biafra fell, that whole sanctions busting beef run, as they called it, was beginning to happen. And that was really where he started to get involved. And I think that the contribution of that, when you think about fighting men of Rhodesia, that was really where a lot of his initial fighting for the country started. Because when he started getting involved with things like ammunition, weapons, that sort of thing, it really made a difference to our ability as a nation to fight. And then later, as the war continued and as Jack started to focus on Rhodesia, as opposed to places like Katanga, Biafra, etc., he got much more involved in the military flying as well. So he actually rolled up his sleeves and not only ran the civilian sanction busting operation, but got into combat as well.
Alan, I think I'm right in saying it was the French intelligence services that helped open up some of those channels. And that was as a result of the friendships that had built up during the Biafran war. And the French were very helpful in French intelligence in facilitating these flights and using Gabon as an intermediary point to get stuff into Europe.
Yeah, that's correct. And again, the French connection started in Katanga. The French were very supportive of Katanga, but again, didn't want to do it directly. So they were quite standoffish, and they got Bob Denard and various other military advisors in there, but it was always in a semi-official capacity. They didn't really want to be involved, but were very active behind the scenes. And they were really a major financer of Biafra. And interestingly enough, worked with the South Africans on the Biafran airlift a lot. So South Africa was very involved there as well. And it was really through their involvement that, because I knew Jack from Katanga, it became a very comfortable relationship. They knew each other and they trusted each other. And that was really one of the things in that murky world of secret services, where sort of trust and pre-knowledge were really important. And Jack, a lot of the international secret services were involved in post-independent Africa. The CIA were very involved in the Congo, the French very involved in Biafra. And that was really where Jack built up a lot of contacts and a lot of valuable connections through these different secret services. He was also involved up until independence with the British. The British used him quite a lot for various operations. I think they were very involved in the Yemen, where Jack was doing weapons flights in for Bob Denard and that sort of thing. So, but the French were supportive all the way, right up until, in fact, even after Zimbabwean independence, they were still using Jack for various operations.
Alan, Jack, also tell us a bit about the Oman connection. I think that came about a lot to do with Tim Landon, the White Sultan, whose brother was a farmer in Rhodesia, and he opened up Oman to the Rhodesians, and Jack was the go-to guy there, in and out of Oman. Yeah,
the need for Jack to Jack had a problem at the time, in that by about 1973, 74, Jack was the benefit of Gabon was waning, and the Sunday Times in the UK did an expose on Jack in 1973 and really cracked open his whole story and how he was running this operation with the DC-8 through Gabon. And so the international community and this anti-sanctions movement got to know exactly how Jack was operating. And so what Jack needed to do from 74, 75 onwards, it became obvious he needed to find another route to Europe and another conduit that he could operate without being scrutinized. And that was really what started his interest in Gabon, I mean, in Oman. And we had already done, the country had already had some contact with Oman through Tim Landon, and an introduction was made, and Jack got to meet with Tim Landon and his local partners. And again, Jack got on very well, not so much with Tim Landon. I mean, they were friends, but Jack became very close to Tim Landon's partners, who were in the Omani, they were basically ministers in the Omani government at that level. And it was through that connection that they really built the operation. And after the first meeting, Jack suggested that they should set up an airline out of Oman and essentially start operating the service based out of Muscat. And it took a while to do that because they needed to get another DCA to run that operation. And that was, as you can imagine with sanctions, quite a difficult operation in itself. But Tim Landon was definitely a very influential force behind that, and really was very sympathetic towards the country. And along that East Africa route up into Oman, that was really where the stepping stone was the Comores, and Jack used the Comores a lot as a result of that route. But Oman opened up a lot of business for Jack, and I think we as a country did really well with that. There was a lot of trade with Iran at the time. The Shah was still running Iran and was very sympathetic to our cause, and a lot of business in that area as well. It was also close to Europe, so it was a route into Europe. So very, very valuable route for us. And that blossomed right up until independence, and then pretty much went into absolute stop after that. The Omanis were very sympathetic to our cause because they'd gone through a similar thing. They were also subject to sort of communist encroachment, had pushed it back and really understood the situation we were in. So we're extremely supportive. And we know when you look at the history, things like the helicopters coming through there, they provided a lot of training for us, and really a big conduit of weapons through that route as well.
Yeah, spare parts for the Air Force. I think
I was going to say those spare parts were interesting because the Omanis would turn a blind eye while Jack's engineers would go to these airfields and literally strip the old aircraft that were sitting there. There was a lot of old British hunters that had been based there. And some of those Air Force bases were active because there was a lot going on in the region. So the British were there manning those Air Force bases. Jack would fly in with his guys. They would strip aircraft almost right under the noses of the British, and sometimes with their support. That's a fascinating chapter of the whole story as well. But we got piles of hunter wings and all sorts of things out of that area.
Alan, tell us a bit about Jack's involvement with the Air Force, with the military, with the SAS. I mean, he was all over the place, doing paradrops. The Chamoil raid was really it was his decoy flight that was a very important component in that whole plan. Just tell us about some of his sort of escapades.
Yeah, and I think this is really where Jack, as a fighting man of Rhodesia, comes to the fore. He was absolutely fearless, and also I think really thought out of the box. He didn't believe necessarily what he was told. He always pushed the boundaries with his aircraft, with what he believed they could do. He never went by the book, and I think that's really what we as a country needed at the time. He had got to know he got to know a lot of the leadership in the Air Force through having flown during the war, and also having been part of the Air Force in the 1950s. He was part of the Air Force Reserve, so knew the leadership of the Air Force quite well. Went and did his Katanga and Biafra thing, came back, and in about 1976, they extended the call up and started calling up older people, and the age group pushed up. So Jack essentially got called up to the Air Force at about the end of 1976. And they put him into the transport squadron because, I mean, what else do you do with a cargo pilot or a cargo captain? So Jack started flying Dakotas and realized that all we had was Dakotas, and started to think about the opportunity to grow that, because obviously the war was hotting up. And he quite quickly said, well, look, I've got this old DC-7, much bigger than the DC-3. What can we do with that? Can I start contributing? And it was literally volunteering his aircraft, which was registered in Gabon at the time. It wasn't even a Rhodesian registered aircraft, civilian foreign registered aircraft. And the conversations then started because he was saying, we need more people to be, more paratroops to be dropped. Can we do this through the DC-7? And the operating manual of the DC-7 said it's impossible to fly without a door. If the door's off, you're done, you can't fly. Jack said, oh no, I don't think that's the truth. I'm sure we can work around that. Took the door off, took it for some flights, and then started with the Air Force practicing parachute drops and that sort of thing. And they worked out how to do it. It was complicated though, because the cable line had to be run on the floor instead of the ceiling, because you had to get the guys down to avoid the tail. So there was a whole lot of turbulence and that sort of thing, because the aircraft went at a much higher speed. And they perfected that and used the aircraft not just for parachute drops, but for supply drops of these raids into enemy territory. And that was really where Jack's connection with the SAS started, because obviously they were very involved. He did a lot of the long-ranged drops for the SAS. And ironically, Jack's own son, he ended up joining the SAS as well. It was a little bit of a family affair there.
Alan, tell us that story. What was that? They had to jettison something over Zambia at one stage. They were flying at night into Zambian airspace, and something went wrong. They had to kick out a crate or something, and the Zambians thought they were being bombed.
Yeah, that was probably about 1977. I can't remember the exact date, but it was a commercial flight from Europe into Rhodesia, as it was, and they had a problem with, and I think it was with the DC-7. The DC-7s were getting old at that stage, never ran on 4 engines. There was always one of the engines down. And they had a problem with the, I think they had 2 engine failures on that particular flight. It was coming from Libreville in Gabon. They didn't have a great deal of cargo on board, but with 2 engines down, they couldn't maintain height. So they were consistently dropping, not at a high pace, but they realized that they wouldn't be able to make it back home. So they decided to start jettisoning the cargo to try and save weight. And it was all industrial fertilizer. So they weren't supposed to be over Zambia. They were doing it in the middle of the night to try and shorten the route. And it was a unoccupied part of the country, so they were tossing this stuff out and organized. They knew they wouldn't have the height to get above the escarpment, so organized to land at Kariba, which they did, and it was all fine, and they made it, and everything was great. But about a week later, Zambia complained to the UN about how these wicked Rhodesians were chemical bombing them. And although there's no parallel, there's a strong feeling that it was because they had found all these chemicals, and that was really the excuse for them to be able to raise an objection to the UN, which was debated in the UN about these terrible Rhodesians having a chemical attack against the Zambian population. Yeah.
Alan, Jack's contribution to the big Chamoil attack, just take us through how that all unfolded.
That was a very ambitious plan, basically because of the distances involved, and there were a couple of different camps that they attacked, and there was a lot of resistance within the Air Force and the military planners, because they felt it was just too far, too ambitious, and couldn't be done, and they were really restricting the raids to helicopter range that they could get in and out quickly. And Jack, when he basically worked out the logistics of the plan and proposed the plan, and that, as you say, included things like the decoy flight overhead, and a lot of that. It took them about 6 months, I think, from the plan first being proposed to being accepted. And it was really, I think the military planners took a long time to come to terms with the audacity of the plan. But I think it was really well planned in terms of the timing, the ability to get that far. And And the whole element of surprise, there was a lot of people, and really that was what they were going for. They needed to try and cut off the flow of insurgents into the country. And they needed to then, we could only win the war by having almost like a conventional battle outside of our territory, where we could get the mass of insurgents before they dissipated in our own country and then became very difficult to find. So the thing about the decoy and what Jack wanted to do is he wanted to attack the base at the time when all of the recruits were on the parade field, because they would be concentrated as a target and we'd be able to have the maximum impact. So what Jack suggested is that for the week or so prior to the attack, he just changed the route of his DC-8 aircraft coming back into Rhodesia to fly over the camp at a fairly high level so that it could be heard. And of course, when they started doing that, after a while, the flight was timed to happen just at the time of the morning parade. So the first couple of times, obviously, everybody was nervous and hid. And after a while, they got used to it. And that was just obviously a commercial route, and they accepted it. And that plan actually worked perfectly because everybody on the day of the raid were on the parade ground. The aircraft went over, they heard the aircraft. They could still hear the whine of the aircraft, but were perfectly used to it. So stayed on the parade ground. But what was actually happening, that was the whine of the Hunters and the Canberras coming in on the tail of the DC-7 that had flown overhead. And when, for the military planners' hesitancy, it was probably one of the most successful raids, not just of the Rhodesian War, but I think of any war. The casualty rate really tipped in the favor of the Rhodesians when you consider that thousands of the enemy were killed and less than 5 of the Rhodesians. In fact, I think 2 or 3 were killed and about 7 were wounded. But the numbers are just astonishing in terms of the weighting to the Rhodesians. And that really, I think, built the reputation of invincibility of the Rhodesians. But it was just such a precisely timed attack. And Jack takes a lot of the credit for that. And that's really where I think he comes to the fore as a fighting man. Because as a fighting man, he contributed not just to the supply of our military, but to really effective and out-of-the-box thinking when it came to attack plans and that sort of thing. And meticulous timing, coordination, resupply. A lot of these, I mean, some of these raids were, 1 or 2 of them were over 1,000 kilometers beyond our borders. Just unheard of at the time.
Alan, he did get an award. He was recognized. I can't remember what award it was that he got, but he got one of the top civilian awards, I think.
He got a couple, actually. And I think he got the, first of all, he got the Independence Commemorative Award for his civil contribution. And that was in sort of mid-1978. And then at the end of 1978, he got the Commander of the Order of the Legion of Merit, and that was quite a major award. Both of them were presented by the acting president at the time, and those were the 2 medals that he got, or the 2 awards that he got during the Rhodesian War, and he had a couple of medals already from his role during the Second World War. So he was quite well decorated. Quite ironic though, because when the task force came into Rhodesia at the time of the election in 1980. A lot of the media, the foreign media, it was the first time they came into the country. So they were looking for stories, and a couple of them did stories on Jack. And they were talking about, one of them, which I think is really ironic, out of a UK newspaper, was talking about Jack Malloch, the hero without a medal. The truth was that he had already received a couple of medals, but their point was, here's this guy who's got an incredible story and really is quite unknown. And that, I think, really epitomized or characterized Jack's life. He didn't like the limelight at all. And although he graciously accepted those awards, he didn't like being high profile. And I think that really went back to his involvement with the French Secret Service, the CIA, the British MI6 prior to independence. He'd been involved with them, and very strong connections with things like the Bureau of State Security in South Africa. And our own Central Intelligence Organization. There's a lot of rumors that still persist that they actually financed the Africaire operation. And so I think with all of that involvement with secret services, he didn't like the limelight at all. So tried to keep a low profile, but had a remarkable life, absolutely, and made a huge contribution to the Rhodesian War. And as you said at the beginning, I think without doubt, he was one of the most significant contributors to the entire war effort, both through the supply of weapons and just general spare parts and that sort of thing to keep the country going. I think he could personally take claim to having kept the country going for years, but also to his role in the military. He was involved in a lot of different things. And also, personally, I mean, a lot of people don't know he was involved with things like the hydrofoil on Kariba. So he seemed to be involved all over the ship.
Remarkable man, Alan, and then a sad ending, but in a way he was doing what he loved. Yeah. When it all came to an end. And I know he was extremely humble, and he refused to acknowledge the fact that he had made such a huge contribution. He was very much of the opinion that he'd just done his duty along with everybody else. He never looked for any recognition or any applause of any sort.
I think that again speaks to his character. And when you think about the opportunity that he had to make tons of money through his involvement with all sorts of deals that were going on, he never did. And I've researched this story for literally 20 years. I've been researching this story, and I've never found evidence that he in any way exploited the situation that he was in. Sure, he made his money, he charged his fee, but it was never extortionate, and he never leveraged the opportunity to pull. And in places like Katanga, a lot of the expat or the mercenaries who were involved there was diamonds everywhere, and they were pilfering left, right, and center. There's no sign of that ever happening with Jack, and it's remarkable. Jack was very against that. I mean, there was a lot of scandal with money going missing in Biafra, and in fact, at one point, Jack was imprisoned in Togo for having an aircraft with about 8 or 10 tons of banknotes on board. But every banknote was accounted for, and it was, the country needed it moved. The currency was being blocked. They needed to get it out, and Jack was happy to do that. And as I say, there's no sign that he personally was involved in any of that. So his integrity was extremely strong. And I think the family suffered a lot as a result, that he didn't really exploit those opportunities. Not that that's what you have to do, but he had a need for financial security, and he never took the temptation. A remarkable person. But going back to the point that you said about his tragic end and how that ended, Jerry Perrin, who was one of the mercenaries that he had known from Katanga, and who was involved in the mercenary revolt in the Congo in 1967. When Jack died, Jerry actually said an interesting thing. He said it's a little bit like a Viking funeral, because Jack couldn't have gone a better way, because he went in the Spitfire that he loved, and it was a circular story of his career having started in Spitfires and really ending in Spitfires. And he said, that's a salute to a great man. An interesting image of the Viking funeral.
Well, Alan, thanks very much for your time, and well done again for getting this all down on the record in print, and now through this medium. Let's hope a lot more people find out about this legendary figure, Jack Malloch, a great man and a great Rhodesian.
And I think that's, as I said in the beginning, it's important to preserve these stories for history, because when Jack did die at his funeral, a lot of people said, well, all of Jack's stories are going to go to the grave with him. And I think that was one of the things that really sparked my interest in telling the story, because I thought, what a tragedy that there's this great man whose stories will go to the grave, and in time, he'll be forgotten. And I'm hoping that through the book, we can at least remind the world of people like Jack and the example of Jack, because my God, right now, we need inspirational role models that we can try and fix what's going on around us. And Jack really, I think, is a remarkable role model of determination, patriotism, and really putting everything on the line for what is good and right. A lot of Jack's flying was about just helping the people on the ground. He flew refugees out of trouble spots, flew supplies in to help people get through. You know, it was really driven by the compassion for the civilians who are victims of this craziness that's often around us. So we need those role models. So I think it's a great story that the world needs to hear.
It certainly is. Alan, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.